Steve Hargadon, and it's the last day of July 25th. This is our 6th webinar, the last of 6 webinars with Pat Farenga about starting to homeschool. Pat is a homeschooling dad as well as an author and speaker about homeschooling, unschooling, and the work of John Holt. He published Growing Without Schooling magazine from Holt's death in 1986 until 2001. And he continues to speak and write about all the ways that we learn without using standard school techniques, and how a civil society is better enhanced by non-compulsory learning. Thanks for being here, Pat.
My pleasure, Steve. Today, I want to talk about one of the great advantages of homeschooling, and that is it allows you and your child, well, especially your child, to move directly to what they want to do or learn. Now, whether you decide to do school at home, unschooling, or any blend of approaches to homeschooling, the one thing you can leverage that works for everybody in any learning situation is travel and the personal and interpersonal learning opportunities it provides. You know, field trips are not given much educational value in school, but for some homeschoolers, travel and the great outdoors can be their entire education program. Now, a lot of homeschoolers and certainly a lot of people in general say the world is our classroom. And when I'm encouraging you to travel and explore and use the world, I don't want you to think of the world as your classroom. The world is not our classroom. The world is our birthright. Humans can grow and flourish in the wild, as our ancestors proved for centuries. It's only recently in human history that we've limited ourselves to thinking that exploring and learning about the world, locally and internationally, is best done as a curated experience. Let's get out of this school mindset from the start. Do away with viewing the world as your classroom. Instead, view the world as an adventure, much as young children do, and learn from it much as young children do too, fearlessly and joyfully. Yeah, I know that's easier said than done for jaded adults and teenagers, but it's the truth and you know it. Fearful and sad children are poor learners. It goes without saying. So I want to use this presentation today to show how the intrinsic value of travel, to show the intrinsic value that travel has to learning. I hope by doing so, you'll also better understand how indirect learning leads to direct learning, and how by learning to be patient with longer frames of time for individual learning, you can reduce your own anxieties about homeschooling. Mark Twain put it well when he had this quote from Innocents Abroad. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating on one little corner of the earth all one's life. You know, of all the reasons to travel, broadening one's horizons is the most important. We live in a world with billions of people and rapidly diminishing resources, and our collective history is far less cooperative than it is competitive. Experience is the enemy of ignorance, and travel is a gateway to understanding the world. Those are the words those last 2 sentences I'm reading are from this website, because I've always liked this quote by Twain, but I came across this, which I thought was fascinating a couple of years ago, and I'm glad I saved this. And this is, also from this Raw Story article. Researchers actually tested this claim by Twain by evaluating levels of trust among those who traveled far and wide, experiencing cultures entirely different from their own, and those who did not. The results would have been obvious to Mark Twain. The more countries one visits, the more trusting he or she will be of others, particularly when those countries are nothing like one's homeland. Now, we know that the human brain responds to novelty very well, and that new experiences are vital to create new neuron connections and so on in the brain. Yet travel is used as sort of an extracurricular activity at best. One of the things that I learned early on as a homeschooler is that homeschoolers really are doing social education. The prejudice is that, oh, they lock themselves at home, bar the doors against all the strangers, and we're just going to sit here and use our McGuffey readers. That may be true for some, but most of the homeschoolers I've met want to get out in the world and use the world and meet people and be with people. And one of the most important things that I think Growing Without Schooling magazine provided the homeschooling movement, particularly in the 80s and 90s, was its directory of homeschooling families. And this was a directory that let you would list the first names and birth years of your children, and then your address or phone number so that people could contact you. I think it was just address, no phone numbers. And this list grew to be so big that we had to sell it, collate it separately. If you look at the issues of GWS, we always put additions to the directory in the back of pages, but of each issue. And it got so big that it became its own standalone publication. And we have people from all over the world listed. And I can't tell you how many people wrote into Growing Without Schooling magazine. You could just go online and look at the archives and check some of this out, where they say, like, oh, I used a directory and I connected my son and daughter with so-and-so in Missouri, and we drove down there and had a wonderful vacation with them. And and then once people would use the telephone and pen pals, and once they got comfortable with one another, their children would travel to stay with these other homeschooling families. So the whole idea of travel is ingrained, I think, in homeschooling, and also in some educational traditions. Like I know, like the Mormon Church requires a year of missionary travel. So this is not a crazy idea, and but it's completely underused. Now, for instance, in school, conventional school socialization theory assumes children of different races and backgrounds will mix joyfully in educational institutions while they learn together. The reality is much different, of course. Social class and income disparities are heightened and maintained in school, not equalized. By and large, for well over 150 years of compulsory schooling, the rich kids do well and the poor kids do poorly, no matter whose theories, money, and politics are in control of schools. Now, I'm not suggesting that school be replaced with travel. What I am suggesting is that travel to new places, close by home and to distant lands, can do more to help change social relations among people of different social classes and broaden one's inner life more than any school curricula does. Let me give you an example. There's this whole subculture in homeschooling of sailing, of families that live on sailboats. And I've since learned that this has been around well before John Holt started Growing Without Schooling magazine in 1977. In fact, one of Holt's favorite books was a series called Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransom. It's a lovely series of books. And that's referring to the names of the rowboats, the sailboats that the kids used in this lake. One was called Swallow, the other was the Amazons. And they would have these adventures. And this is, sailing is very much tied to adventure, in our minds. And the first book that I saw, and I'm sure there's probably even more, but the first book that I ever saw about this and that we sold at Holt Associates is Kids for Sale. And, that was specifically about homeschooling. And then I've since learned about this book here, Lesson Plans Ahoy, hands-on learning for homeschooling sailors. This mom, Nadine Slavinsky, I believe has a master's in education from Harvard. And with her husband, they went out and toured the world, living on a boat with their children. Now, before I go any further in this, because this next one, 360 degrees longitude, man is rather wealthy and it's a very well-equipped boat. But what I want to point out is just because these people have lived on sailboats doesn't mean that they're incredibly wealthy. As I said, it's sort of a subculture. Yes, if you read 360 Degrees of Longitude, that is a very wealthy family, and they have a very nice boat and so on. Kids for Sale and the others, you'll start to see it's a little, so these the prejudices that we always hear about homeschooling and unschooling. Oh, it's only for the privileged few. I want to try and dispel that about the sailing thing. And I myself am not a sailor, by the way. That's not my thing. It's actually my wife's thing, though. Anyway, what is also important is it's not just families that can do this. Like, you could just go up to Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire and spend a day doing this, and it'd be a wonderful thing. You could do it anytime during the year, except maybe the winter in New Hampshire. But these are things that are very important for children to do, I feel, particularly if they choose to do it. And this brings up a really big issue. What do you let children do? For instance, this teenager here, Zach Sunderland, set the record for being the youngest person to sail around the world. He was homeschooled, and in fact, his family, I've since learned, is all like into boating, and I think he has a couple of siblings who are also doing similar things. But Zach set the record, and people were very impressed with that. Although, of course, they were all concerned that Zach wasn't keeping up with his schoolwork. But the fact is, he did, and they made a point of of showing that in videos and stuff as he was touring around the world. On the other hand, a little more recently, a young lady named Laura Decker from Holland wanted to go around the world. She started her dad supported her because he knew what a good sailor she was, but she wanted to do this at the age of 12, and she got into so much trouble for even suggesting it. Of doing a solo circumnavigation that the Dutch officials prevented her from doing it, claiming that it was her education would suffer. And make a long story short, because there were a lot of twists and turns to it. In 2010. The Dutch court ended the social worker supervision of Laura Decker and decided it was up to the girl's parents to decide whether she could make the trip. And upon that, Laura Decker said she's going to leave in 2 weeks. And then she did sail around the world, and it became this movie, Maiden Trip, which you could see here, this documentary. Now, when she was in Australia, Laura Decker gave an interview. Oh, and she wasn't officially homeschooling at the beginning of all this, but in order to appease the authorities, they said that if she did a homeschooling program while she was on the boat, that would be acceptable. So she signed up with a place called, let me get the right name, World School, but the Dutch word WERELDSCHOOL. And by having that cover, she was able to go. But then when she reached Australia, she gave an interview in which she admitted that she was not doing much homework. Said she was busy sailing, maintaining the boat, customs procedures, and other tasks unrelated to her journey. And this led to the press and other commentators suggesting that she quit school and threw her school books overboard. Now, she tried to stop this by saying that she had never stopped studying totally and would continue her academic studies after returning to the Netherlands. I mean, to me, I just get burned up when I hear these things. Here's a young adult sailing around the world on her own, and we are busting her chops and making her feel bad that she's not keeping up with trigonometry and algebra. She's able to calculate her path on a map and use GPS. It is kind of crazy, but again, this is because she's a kid. If she was 21, I doubt that she would have even received any press about this. But because she was not an adult, it gets her in trouble. And Decker actually makes an interesting point. Decker said, the authorities thought that my trip was dangerous. Well, everywhere is dangerous. They don't sail. She's talking about the authorities. They don't sail, and they don't know what boats are, and they are scared of them. And I think that's so true about so many things in our life, and of homeschooling and unschooling. The idea that we're going to let our children sail all year, oh my gosh, that just blows people's minds. Well, here's another one. This is an even smaller subculture, very teeny subculture in the homeschooling community, but Civil Air Patrol. On the handout, I've given two places, the Civil Air Patrol site, which is for kids 12 and up, and then another organization called Young Eagles, which is for kids 8 and up, who are interested in becoming pilots and in flying, and in actually flying in the cockpit with pilots. So there are things to do. And of course, there was a horrible story back in the 80s of I forget her name, but a young girl who was piloting a plane, a homeschooled girl, and it crashed, unfortunately. But these things happen too. I mean, there are risks in life. I'm not so sure I think she was only 10 or something. Having a 10-year-old fly the plane was the smartest thing. But Laura Decker and Zach Sunderland had tons of evidence that they could sail and be competent, and they succeeded. Parents are going to say, "Oh, they'd be better off in school." Well, how do you know? Maybe they'd be bullied. Maybe they'd be depressed. Maybe they feel so bored by school that they turn to drugs or something. We don't know. I mean, these ideas that everything is a risk to a child everything is a risk to a child in a sense. But we have to allow the child some competency and then trust that competency once they develop it. It takes a lot of trust, and I think that sailing and Civil Air Patrol are two great examples of how hard it can be. I don't know if there's anyone who's got any questions or anything at this point, or comments that they'd like to make. I'm kind of hoping that there might be some homeschool sailors or flyers in the audience. But please, type in your comments, and Steve will interrupt me, and I'd be happy to have you join the conversation. Another thing is money. A lot of us think, especially if we're homeschooling and sacrificing one income, we think that we can't do travel. Well, when I talk about travel, yeah, I'm talking about sailing around the world and flying. Those are the big things. Going to Europe if you're living in North America. Those are the big things. But I'm also talking about travel, like going to the next city or going to the next state, or travel in its broadest sense. And there are some books that really emphasize how you can save money on travel. I've always liked Homeschooling on a Shoestring, which touched a little bit on travel, but just overall about how to save a lot of money. Well, because by the way, I know I've said this in an earlier webinar, but studies have shown that most homeschooling families only spend $500 on average per child per year on educational expenses. That's because using things like the public library and other free resources and internet resources, really can cut down on this stuff, and not purchasing expensive, curriculum that monitors you every minute of the day, or that you feel compelled to use because you spent so much money on it. Now, you can relax and just pick and choose and use it. Other ways that, I'm going to talk more about what we've done as a family, traveling in inexpensive ways that we've done travel with our children too as homeschoolers. A really big thing to remember is you can travel as a homeschooler at all the off-peak times. So I know a lot of homeschoolers go to Disneyland when school starts in the fall. And a lot go to Hawaii or go to those traditional travel destinations with their families before or after school vacation weeks, and not during the holidays. You can do that, and you can plan it well in advance because you are in control of your schedule. It's not the school's schedule, and you're all just trying to do your important stuff around the school schedule. You do all your stuff the way you want. That's why a great advantage to homeschooling. This is from a website I found where this man who's been living on a boat with his children for 10 years. He wrote about his experiences, the 10 lessons that he learned. And, you know, it can't be repeated enough. As I started this presentation with us, the world is a natural learning environment. It doesn't need to be curated for us. Yeah, it's nice to have someone explain things, and it's nice to have people who have answers when you have questions. But there's a big difference between, you know, the learner asking questions and the teacher asking questions. Dr. Ray Moore often used to say, you can always tell a good learning situation by who's asking the questions. If the kids are asking the questions, it's a really good learning situation. If they're not, there's a problem. So the world is a natural learning environment. The questions will arise. And if you don't know the answers, that's wonderful. It's a great learning opportunity to model how to figure things out. So you can take your child to the lab. You can find like somebody who knows more about plants or animals, whatever the question is, and ask these questions. And then as he notes here, by even living on a boat, history, geography, science, maths, art, languages never feel like a chore when they're studied as part of a journey. And this is true of us landlubbers, homeschoolers too, unschoolers in particular. When you view education as a journey, you know, as being having a growth mindset, it's a completely different way of looking at it. Now you're not thinking of it as a classroom where you're marching through, you know, a curriculum to get a gold star or a grade, or hey, I get to go to the next class and I go from 7th to 8th grade. Now it's a journey. You're going from, you know, inexperience to experience and making friends and seeing new things and going places. Travel, you know, is both an interior and an exterior phenomenon for us when we're involved in it. And I can't emphasize enough how we have to trust that this will happen. You know, we all think that learning only happens if a teacher makes them, you know. And that's not true. The work of Sugata Mitra has shown that learning happens when groups of children are together. And we know from history and from our own experience that we can teach ourselves, that we learn things, we make discoveries by thinking and reflecting. You know, I mean, it's not always, yes, a good teacher is important, but it's, you know, when you need them. And we don't always need them. We need the world. We need the world. Oh, one last thing I'd like to say about the sailboat thing in the world. Naturally, this is what, you know, everything I'm saying here. This is the parents' point of view. I'm certain that there are kids living on sailboats who may not enjoy or share this perspective, and that they wish that they were among other children in school. I mean, it's not hard to find negative articles written about living and learning while being homeschooled on a sailboat by young people, and they didn't like it. You know, not all of them, but, you know, there's some negative out there. And like homeschooling on land, everyone's mileage varies with homeschooling depending on their unique situations. Homeschooling isn't a solution for everyone, but homeschooling shows everyone just how bold, exciting, and involving life can be for children when adults involve them in their activities, rather than make them spend years in school simply getting prepared to get involved in adult activities. So I'm going to talk about the informal ways of setting up exchanges in a little bit, but, you know, people seem to like programs and the convenience of doing things somewhat anonymously through the internet or through the mail and stuff. And these exchange programs were recommended very highly in this book, which I also recommend highly, The New Global Student by Maya Frost. It really is full of wonderful firsthand accounts of how many kids, and not all of them, in fact, very few of them are actually homeschoolers, you know, but these are kids who got burned out in high school or college and then decided, you know, let me save them, take my tuition money and travel and see what happens. And the stories are quite inspiring. Now these exchange programs are for, you know, sending your, you know, an American child abroad, as well as for having, and sometimes they involve having foreign students come and stay with you. But I'm going to talk about, that's a hosting situation, and that's a little bit different. So just in terms of although they do call these exchange programs, so these three programs probably do have that hosting component. So there's a lot out there, and you don't have to pay a lot of money to be involved in these programs. In fact, some of them, like Rotary, actually have scholarships and stuff, so you can do it. There are also programs just for homeschoolers and unschoolers. Unschool Adventures by Blake Bowles has been around for, I think, 5 years now. And he's getting ready for the next adventure, which is New Zealand in 2016. It's a 6-week adventure in February and March. I highly recommend Blake's work as well as his adventures. I've heard nothing but good things from people who've been on them. And Lainey Liberty runs a program called Project World School, and she has a very interesting blog, raisingmiro.com, because she is sort of a world schooler. She's raised her son traveling around the world, but now Miro's a young adult, and so they're moving into more of a program and less of a just themselves traveling around. And they're actually running retreats and so on for families, as well as Blake's Unschool Adventures is just for teens. Project World School also is for teens and their families. It seems to have a couple of other components to it. And then here's probably the most familiar thing that people think of when they have international students, and that's hosting them in your home. Now, you know, the great advantage of this is that you're not going to have to travel far to experience foreign cultures and meet new people. You can host them in your home. This is a formal program like Service will not only put a foreign student in your home, but also help you find a foreigner who will let your son or daughter stay with them. So, but you can also just do hosting with them. You don't have to do an exchange. My wife, for instance, worked with a program of Korean students, and for 2 weeks during one summer, they came to our house. I think it was about 12 of them. They were in our living room and trying to learn English. And the program supplied my wife with a book that they used for teaching them English, and then she had to take them on a field trip. Everything was planned, and they had other people who met her when it was time to do the field trip. So, but the advantage is our 3 daughters got to meet these Koreans and talk with them, and over the course of 2 weeks, got some pretty interesting information. But also, you can find that you can provoke interest in travel. Like 2 of my 3 daughters love travel, and my wife and I do. But one of my daughters doesn't. But what we found helps provoke an interest in travel are movies and books and stories about foreign lands and foreign things. And so, you lead a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink. And sometimes certainly we had to take our daughter when she was younger, but as she got older and she didn't want to come on trips with us, sometimes she stayed home, and and that's the way it worked for her. But she eventually decided that she wanted to come with us more often than not, rather than stay home with the grandparents. So service is a formal way. But now I'd like to. I'm sorry. But now I'd like to talk about hosting and traveling on your own. Earlier, I had mentioned the Growing Without Schooling directory, where parents just looked for families that had kids the same age as theirs and said, hey, we're homeschooling, unschooling too, please, let's connect. There are so few of us back in the 80s, and the directory was big. And now it's interesting to me that as homeschooling has grown and how the internet has allowed connectivity to exponentially increase the way it was over the 5,000 to 10,000 people we had who were reading Growing Without Schooling. My gosh, I can't find. There used to be a homeschool social register that's now closed. There's, you would think that there would be all sorts of directories of homeschoolers online, but for some reason, the information explosion is not connecting people. It's like there's a lot of little niches, a lot of little directories, a lot of little micro directories for homeschoolers and stuff, but there's no national directory, and that always kind of that still surprises me. But anyway, you don't need a national directory. You could work one-on-one, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First, my oldest daughter, Lauren, who's now 29. We had a family come in from Great Britain, and they stayed here, and they didn't stay at our house, but we hooked up with them a couple of times, and their children, and got along very well with our children, and we liked family, and so we stayed in touch with them when they went back to England. And a good friend of my daughter's here, Adrian, at the time, wanted to go to England. Lauren said that she knew someone in England and she would love to go to England, and so we worked it out so that she and Adrian were able to travel at the age of 14, I believe. Certainly no more than 16, but they were younger. As we had to do all that solo flight stuff with both of them. But our two families got together and made the arrangements, and they were able to fly from Logan to Great Britain. They were met at the airport and then taken to this family's house. And they spent 2 weeks in Great Britain with this family, and then flew back home. And they had a great time. And again, we just set that up, amongst ourselves. You don't need to use these big companies if you can make these sorts of connections. And of course, it helps that we met them physically, face to face, more than once. So we know about this. And another example that might ring true for a lot of people is my daughter Audrey developed a strong interest in Japanese culture, and she did study Japanese, and one of her friends her mom is Japanese, and she became close with them for a couple of years. During the same period that she was studying Japanese, the mom was impressed that this little 10-year-old girl was learning Japanese, and so when I think she was 11 or 12, when she was invited to accompany this family to visit their grandparents in Nagoya, Japan, and Audrey went with them. We had to pay for a flight and her expenses over there, but they were minimal compared to what it would be like if she had to stay at a hotel and have all these other people, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was great that we could do this for her. And she got so much out of it, and we're still friends with the family. And it really, again, for a 12-year-old, she had to travel on her own home from Japan. She was able to travel over there with the family, but they were going to spend like months over there. So she traveled from Tokyo to Boston on her own, at the age of 12. Again, a very empowering experience, just a simple little thing like that, like traveling on a plane. But I know it really filled Audrey with a sense of confidence. And again, that's something that you don't bank on or really think is important until years later when they keep talking about this, about how important it was to feel independent at that age. And then, how'd I go that way? I want to go this way. All right. And so let's talk about travel locally. I mean, let's say you really don't have a lot of money or an inclination to do any of these things. Don't forget that the world around us is full of great adventures, as long as we would open ourselves to them. So this book, Walk When the Moon is Full, is a wonderful story. It's a true story about a family living in a farm in Wisconsin. And the kids wanted to go out at night, and finally the mom, sets it up, and they do. And it's a lovely story about how the world is different at night, and how the parents and the child learn this through walking through the woods at night. Lovely thing. And we were inspired by that book to walk through our neighborhood in Brighton, Massachusetts, when we lived there, late at night with our daughter Lauren, which was about 4, and it is different, I mean, you don't see skunks during the day usually in Brighton, Massachusetts. We saw a couple that night and stuff like that. You can travel even though you're home. It's like going to a new place at night and opening your eyes and ears to what the nighttime is like. Or if you live in Wisconsin, or as Ben Hewitt does, lives in rural Vermont, his children, his two boys, developed an intense interest in nature and trapping. For some reason, trapping became really important to them. They started to learn everything about how to trap animals and so on. And it's just a wonderful story to me. And again, it just proves to me how many different ways there are to learn. Now, I know what you're all saying. Oh, well, how are they going to have a living as a trapper? Look, these kids are only 10 and 12, if that, you know. But they now know how to do so many things. They can navigate through the woods and identify trees and cook for themselves and make shelter. I mean, it's amazing how competent these young people are. That's going to pay them incredible benefits should they decide to move into the city and become computer coders or something at some point. We don't know, but right now we do know what they want to do, and they want to be trappers. And Ben writes about this in some really beautiful prose, I think, and I can't recommend Homegrown enough. If you're wondering, like, well, you know, I can't afford, you know, tons of curricula. I can't have, you know, a great biology class here. Use nature. Use the resources that are available to you. Another book, and again, this one is not directly about homeschooling at all. It's called Up by Patricia Ellis. I'm sorry, I can't read her last name. It's on the handout. But and I read this book a couple of years ago, but it was really beautiful about a mom and her daughter doing peak bagging, which is a practice or a pseudo sport, and for hikers where they decide that they're gonna go to certain mountain peaks like that have some sort of common features like height, or you know, they're in a certain region and they want to go to each peak within a certain period of time. So the mom and her daughter get completely into peak bagging and climbing mountains in New Hampshire. And again, it's a lovely story. And when you think about all the learning that is taking place in all three of these books, but what is happening? All three of these books, the people are walking through nature. That's it. They're not paying people thousands of dollars to put them on a cruise ship to listen to lectures. Sounds like fun to me, except paying thousands of dollars. But yeah, and I would do that. I would go on a cruise ship sometime. But you don't need to. Look how beautiful the world is set up for us to learn from. So, you know, when we think of travel, it doesn't have to always be this. I mean, I'm also aware of homeschoolers who will, you know, just get in the car and travel to like a really old village, maybe 1 or 2 hours away from their home with the kid, to go check out the local historical societies and go look at old graveyards. And very often they start to find connections between last names or place names or certain incidents, and in local churches that have, you know, lots of historical records. All this stuff, you know, can be used by you in homeschooling, because you know you're off the education, the standard education grid where everyone's learning Common Core, and now you're in your own. So, you know, you can use different cities to inspire discussion about geography, history, culture, and ethics. You know, for instance, you know, one thing that we did, and again, this is hindsight, you know, here in Massachusetts is an old children's rhyme. Lin, Lin, city of sin. You'll never come out the way you went in. What looks like gold is really tin. The girls say no, but they'll give in. Lin, Lin, the city of sin. Why did it get that reputation? Why do my girls back in the 1990s still say that little rhyme? Well, we looked it up. It turned out Lynn had quite a history of high crime all throughout the late 1890s, right through the 1930s, and that reputation is stuck with it. You know, there's all sorts of ways that you can learn about the world and geography and history, and it doesn't just have to be from the textbook. And then I want to end with a story from John Gatto, who was a New York City Teacher of the Year. And in his book, I believe it was Dumbing Us Down, he wrote a story about, and he won the New York City Teacher of the Year award and the New York State Teacher of the Year award for doing things like this. John realized that one of his students was interested in learning more about the ocean, but had never been to the ocean. And this is not uncommon for city kids, unfortunately, right? They're there in a city, but the only way that they know about the ocean is through television and pictures. So John really felt it was important. I'm really condensing the story here. That the single mom and his son go to the beach. And so out of his own pocket, he paid for them to take a bus ride and spend the day down in Atlantic City. And as you read in the book, it pays so many dividends to this child in the classroom and in his life later on. And of course, it helped the mom feel pretty good about, her son and the support that he was getting from people like John Gatto. Again, it's things like that we should really be considering when we talk about education reform. It's things like social relationships, travel, enjoying nature, enjoying each other's company while you travel, that really encourage and nurture learning. Teachers like John Gatto know this. And in fact, I know that there are some schools, but they're alternative schools. They're off the mainstream where travel is used as the curriculum. I hope that you will consider using it and not feel that your circumstances are hemming you in. Maybe you would get lucky and have someone like a John Gatto who would say, "Here, you take your kid out down to the beach." But you know what? You can do it. And it's worthwhile. It's better maybe to take it is better to take your child to the beach for a day and relax and explore and learn and see something new than it is to sit down and drill them for the next test. In fact, I would predict that relaxing them and enjoying the beach together would put them in a better frame of mind and make studying for that test so much easier if you must do that. So I want to thank you for joining me about starting to homeschool your children. I hope I've helped you to begin your homeschooling journey with confidence and to see that you don't have to spend your time constantly monitoring, entertaining, and teaching your children if you decide to homeschool. You can purchase canned curricula and find tutors online and offline for any subject if you or your child see a need for it. But don't let that be the tail that wags your homeschooling dog. Instead, use real-life activities, conversation, and self-reflection to nurture your children's self-directed learning abilities, and use canned curricula on an as-needed basis. Most of all, remember time is on your side. Learning happens all the time, on weekends and summer vacation, and I hope this final installment of my Starting to Homeschool series gives you confidence to go beyond standardized textbooks and school schedules and create your own unique homeschooling family experience. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them, Steve.
Okay, so if you have a question for Pat, there's a slight delay in the broadcast, so it takes a second for us to see the questions. But if you click on the Q&A icon that's in the event, you can ask a question, or you can put it in the chat for the event, and I should see it there. I don't see any questions immediately, Pat, but I love the description of things that could be done locally.
Thank you.
And there are some traditional schools that do a good job of kind of what the name of the program is, but where they focus on a creek or some other thing. But what struck me was the individualized nature of the interests versus a decision that an adult makes. Is that kind of a hallmark of this process? Is the child finding something they really care about?
Absolutely, and also involving the child. I mean, if they don't know what California is like, and why it would be different from Alaska, and you live in Alaska, you can show them pictures of California and say, here we go. I mean, you can come up with the ideas and involve the child in it, but very often I think the child will come up with ideas I don't know where Audrey got the idea she wanted to go to Japan, but that had been in her brain since she was about 5 years old. So, you know, I mean, that had nothing to do with us putting that interest there. But again, you know, it can work both ways. But the thing is to be gentle when it comes from you, and to learn to accept no if it comes from you. I mean, accept no from the child if they decide, well, you know, I really don't want to go to California.
There's an interesting parallel, I think, right, with travel away from home, right? And that would be sort of the difference between the highly structured, scheduled visit, say, to Washington, D.C., and the, okay, we have a week and we're going to go to Washington, D.C., and what would we each be interested in, and then working together to build a program based on what the children are interested in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That sounds wonderful. You know,
yeah. I think Laney Liberty's program now is in that regard. They do these month-long trips, but then they spend some amount of time, weeks in advance, with the students actually organizing what they want to do and creating the schedule.
Right. I think that's so important and really wonderful. You know, and again, that's probably with older kids, teens, but I think you could do it even with a 6-year-old or younger, get involved in like what would you like to see, and showing them like the opportunities that will be there, and you could discuss, you know, if you could see certain things because of where you're going to be. I mean, and again, like there's so much quote unquote education that's taking place just during that discussion with your child about, you know, what do you want to do once we get to Europe or Ireland or North Dakota?
Yeah, fun.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any questions. I think you've done such a good job that you answered all the questions.
All right. Well, let's enjoy the last day of July. It's a beautiful day here in Boston, and I hope it is where you are too, Steve.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, everybody. This